The night was electric. It was the kind of evening that every actor dreamed of. Thousands of flashing cameras, a red carpet lined with stars, and a crowd buzzing with excitement. It was the premiere of a big-budget action film, and the who's who of Hollywood had gathered in the heart of the city. The venue, a sleek theater with gold-trimmed walls and velvet ropes, was the perfect backdrop for a night of glitz and glamour. Among the sea of celebrities, one person stood out. Keanu Reeves. He wasn't the loudest, nor was he trying to draw attention to himself. In fact, he rarely ever did. Keanu had a reputation for being humble and down-to-earth, a stark contrast to the usual Hollywood bravado. The cameras were trained on him as he walked down the red carpet, but instead of posing in exaggerated ways or feeding into the chaos, he simply smiled quietly and greeted fans with his usual calmness. It was that peaceful aura that made him so beloved by the public. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just there, enjoying the moment like anyone else. However, in the midst of all the excitement, there was one person who wasn't quite as mesmerized by Keanu's calm presence. An entertainment reporter, known for his sharp, sometimes cutting style, was already preparing for his moment. This was not just any reporter. He prided himself on his ability to stir up controversy, get the juiciest quotes, and make headlines. And tonight, he saw an opportunity in Keanu. He had always been curious about the actor's reserved nature and thought it might be interesting to push him a little. Make him uncomfortable, maybe even get him to snap. Keanu, after all, was seen as a gentle soul, the kind of person you wouldn't expect to bite back. But this reporter was confident he could get under his skin. If he could make Keanu react, it would be the perfect story. As Keanu neared the press line, the reporter knew it was now or never. He straightened his tie, adjusted his press badge, and positioned himself at the front of the crowd. He had done this 1,000 times before, asking the usual questions, getting the usual answers. But tonight he had a different approach in mind. He was determined to be bolder, to make Keanu uncomfortable. When Keanu finally approached, the reporter wasted no time. "Keanu, you've been in Hollywood for decades now," he began with a smile that was almost too wide. "Do you ever feel like you're falling behind? I mean, a lot of new actors are emerging and your roles seem to be, well, a bit predictable." Keanu looked at him, his expression unreadable. There was a slight pause, but it wasn't awkward. It was as though Keanu was measuring his response carefully, as he always did. The reporter, sensing an opportunity, didn't give him much time to respond before continuing. "I mean, look at how fast the industry is changing," the reporter pressed. "People are talking about how you've become a bit of a relic. Don't you think you need to adapt? The industry is all about staying relevant, isn't it?" Keanu didn't flinch. He simply nodded politely, as if the question had been asked in good faith. The reporter, however, was eager to push further. "You know, you've made a name for yourself in a certain type of movie, but have you ever thought about branching out, taking on something that's more modern?" The reporter continued, his voice dripping with a subtle sense of superiority, something that aligns more with the new generation of actors and filmmakers. At this point, the crowd of photographers and reporters stood still, sensing that something bigger might be unfolding. The air was thick with anticipation, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire red carpet event had come to a halt. Everyone was watching Keanu's response. Keanu, however, remained unfazed. He took a deep breath, his eyes soft yet steady. "I've always chosen roles based on what resonates with me," he said, his voice calm and grounded. "I've never tried to chase trends or conform to what people think I should be doing. I believe in following what feels right, not what others expect of me." The reporter was not expecting this. Keanu's response was measured, almost gentle, and it threw him off. He wasn't ready to back down. In fact, this only fueled his desire to make the actor react in some way. After all, reporters like him thrived on stirring the pot. "So you're saying that you've never felt the pressure to change, to grow with the industry?" the reporter asked, his tone sharp and almost mocking. "You don't think there's something sad about holding on to the past like that? The world has moved on, Keanu. Don't you ever think that it's time for a change?" Keanu paused again, but this time his eyes narrowed slightly, though his face remained calm. "Change doesn't always mean following trends," he replied quietly. "It means growing from within. I've always tried to be true to myself, and I think that's what has mattered most to my fans." The reporter pressed on, sensing that he was getting closer to something. But don't you feel like you're being left behind? It's like you're stuck in the 90s. John Wick is great, but what else do you have? You've made your name, sure, but isn't it time to evolve? Keanu's face remained as serene as ever. It was almost as if the reporter's words were falling away unnoticed. He took a step closer to the reporter, his presence commanding attention without the need for words. Maybe some people would call it stuck, Keanu said softly, his voice still steady. But I don't measure myself by the opinions of others or by what the world says is new. I measure it by whether or not I've been true to the person I want to be, and that's something I'll never apologize for. The reporter's smug smile faltered for a second. He wasn't expecting this kind of response, certainly not this level of self-assuredness. Keanu wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was simply being himself, and it was powerful. It was disarming in a way that made the reporter look small. The reporters around them started to murmur, exchanging glances. Some of them nodded in quiet approval of Keanu's response. The crowd, which had been eagerly waiting for a confrontation, began to sense that they weren't going to get the drama they had hoped for. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass in grace under pressure. But the reporter wasn't ready to give up just yet. His instincts told him that he could get something from Keanu if he pushed hard enough. He knew that people loved the drama, the fireworks. That's what sold stories. He had one more question in mind. So what about your age? Aren't you worried that people will stop taking you seriously soon? He shot, thinking that this might be the question that would break Keanu's cool exterior. After all, you've been in this industry for so long. How much longer can you keep going at this pace? Keanu's face remained unchanged. But now, there was a slight shift in his posture, as if he had already answered this question countless times in his life, and had long since moved beyond the need to explain. He looked directly at the reporter and, in the calmest of tones, said, "Age is just a number. What matters is how you live each day and what you give to the world around you. I don't focus on things I can't control." The reporter, trying to save face, opened his mouth to speak again, but his words caught in his throat. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his career, that Keanu was not only a skilled actor but also a man who carried himself with a quiet strength that was impossible to rattle. And just like that, the conversation was over. The reporter had hoped to provoke a heated exchange, but instead, he found himself standing before a man who simply refused to be drawn into drama. The rest of the press line was already moving on to the next celebrity, but the reporter remained standing, his mind racing. He had come looking for a story, but all he had gotten was a lesson in humility. The crowd continued to buzz with excitement as Keanu moved along the red carpet, effortlessly greeting fans and posing for pictures. The reporter, still feeling the sting of his failed attempt to provoke the actor, stood off to the side, trying to shake off the awkwardness of the moment. He had been so sure that Keanu would crack under pressure, but instead he had walked away with nothing but a few polite words. There was no drama, no explosive reaction to fuel his story. He paced back and forth for a moment, scanning the crowd, his mind already turning over how he could make up for the missed opportunity. He wasn't about to let one interaction define his night. The reporter wasn't in this business to play nice. He was here for the headlines, and Keanu, for all his calm and peace, was exactly the kind of person who made headlines when you pushed hard enough. He knew that reporters like him didn't get the good stories by being polite or respectful. They got them by digging deeper, by asking the tough questions, by being willing to make someone uncomfortable. And tonight he wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. As the night went on, the red carpet event began to wind down. Most of the celebrities had already posed for their photos and had been whisked away inside the theater. But the reporter was determined to get one more chance with Keanu. He knew that sometimes, the best moments happened when you least expected them. Then, just as the last few photographers were packing up their gear, Keanu started to make his way toward the entrance. It seemed like the perfect moment. The crowd had thinned, and Keanu was walking at a steady pace, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. The reporter quickly jogged over, positioning himself to intercept the actor before he could make it through the doors. Keanu paused for a moment, noticing the reporter standing there once again. There was a slight, almost imperceptible smile on his face, as if he knew what was coming. The reporter took a deep breath, trying to summon all his bravado. He wasn't about to let the opportunity slip through his fingers this time. He had to go for the jugular. "Keanu," the reporter called out, his voice sharp but forced. I know you've been in this business for a long time, but I have to ask, how much longer are you going to keep making these action movies? Aren't you worried people are getting tired of seeing you in the same roles? Keanu stopped in his tracks. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was something more powerful in his gaze, a quiet understanding that this was a moment he had seen coming. He didn't even blink as the reporter continued. Look, I get it, the reporter said, trying to sound sympathetic. John Wick was great, but how many more movies like that can we expect from you? At some point, doesn't it get old? You've built this persona as the action hero. But don't you think it's time to break away from that? The words hung in the air, almost daring Keanu to respond. The reporter was certain that this would be the moment he finally broke through. He could almost hear the sound of the story being written in his mind. Keanu would snap, maybe even get defensive. That's what the reporter was hoping for. He wanted a reaction, any kind of reaction. But again, Keanu remained calm, his face unreadable. There was no frustration, no irritation, just that same gentle smile, the kind that made you feel like everything was okay no matter how tough the question was. Keanu took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. I think what people don't realize, Keanu said, his voice steady and kind, is that every role I choose, every movie I do, it's because I connect with it. I don't do something just because it's popular or because people want to see it. I do it because it speaks to me in some way. If I ever felt like I was just repeating myself, then I would stop. But that's not the case. The reporter was taken aback. He had expected Keanu to give a more rehearsed response, one that might give him something to work with. But instead, he was getting sincerity. There was no anger, no defensive tone, just truth. Keanu wasn't playing the game. He was playing his own game, and it had nothing to do with the reporter's expectations. So you really think you've still got something to offer the industry? The reporter pressed, trying to get a reaction. I mean, the whole action hero thing, it's kind of played out, right? Aren't you worried you're going to be left behind, like so many other actors who are stuck in their past roles? Keanu's smile remained. There was no hesitation in his voice when he replied, I'm not worried about that. I'm just focused on doing the work that I love. If people want to watch, that's wonderful. If not, that's okay too. But I'm not in this for validation. I'm in it because it's what I enjoy. The reporter's jaw tightened. He had expected Keanu to flinch, to show some sign of vulnerability. Instead, Keanu had just reinforced his point. He wasn't interested in the validation of others. He wasn't worried about fitting into some mold or playing by anyone else's rules. Keanu was a man who had long since found peace in doing what he loved, and it was clear that nothing was going to shake him from that. The reporter, sensing that he wasn't going to get the dramatic moment he was hoping for, shifted tactics once again. He narrowed his eyes and leaned in closer, a little more confrontational now. You say you're not in it for the validation, but how do you explain the way people treat you? You've got this huge fan base, but it's almost like you've become a symbol of something, a kind of idol. Doesn't that bother you? Keanu looked at him for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. It was as though he was considering the question deeply, but not in the way the reporter expected. He wasn't looking for a way to defend himself. He was simply reflecting on what was being asked. Finally, Keanu spoke. It's not about being an idol, he said, his tone gentle but firm. It's about being human. I don't want people to look at me and think I'm some kind of perfect person. I'm just like everyone else. I make mistakes, I have my ups and downs, and I try to do the best I can. If people admire me for that, then I'm grateful. But I'm not trying to be something I'm not. The reporter paused. The words hit him harder than he expected. There was something disarming about Keanu's sincerity. It was clear that the actor wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He wasn't playing a game, and he wasn't trying to conform to anyone's expectations. He was simply existing in the world as his authentic self. For a brief moment, the reporter felt a pang of uncertainty. Was he really the one who should be questioning this man? Was he the one who had the right to poke and prod at Keanu's choices? But just as quickly as the thought came, the reporter pushed it aside. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let this moment of doubt stand in the way of his story. He was a journalist, after all. It was his job to ask the tough questions, to challenge his subjects. He couldn't back down now, not when he was so close to the story he had been chasing all night. You know, people say that you're one of the last true action stars left, the reporter said, his voice returning to its earlier sharpness. But what happens when that fades? When the action rolls dry up, what will you do then? What's your plan? Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply smiled again, that same quiet, calm smile that had disarmed the reporter from the start. "I'll keep doing what I've always done," he said. "I'll keep showing up, keep working hard, and keep being true to myself. That's all I can do." The reporter stood there for a long moment, his mind spinning. He had come to the premiere hoping to expose something about Keanu, something raw or controversial. Instead, he had found a man who was steadfast, unwavering, and entirely unconcerned with the opinions of others. In that moment, the reporter knew that he wasn't going to get the story he had imagined. But what he had witnessed was something much more powerful, an encounter that had left him questioning his own approach, his own values. The reporter walked away from the red carpet that evening feeling both defeated and strangely unsettled. He had come with one mission in mind: to provoke Keanu Reeves to find something, anything that would reveal a crack in the actor's calm exterior. But what he had found instead was something he hadn't expected: a man who was completely at peace with himself, who was uninterested in the drama or the games the reporter wanted to play. Keanu's answers had been calm, firm, and completely unshakable. There had been no defensive outbursts, no moments of frustration. It was as if Keanu wasn't playing the same game at all. The reporter had expected to uncover a scandal or at least provoke some sort of reaction, but instead, he had been left with nothing but his own discomfort. The words Keanu had spoken, simple yet profound, echoed in his mind as he made his way back to the press room. "I'm not in this for validation," Keanu had said. "I'm just being true to myself." Those words stayed with him, gnawing at him in a way he couldn't shake. For all his bravado, the reporter found himself feeling unsettled by Keanu's quiet strength. The actor wasn't just some washed-up star clinging to the past as he had hoped to paint him. No, Keanu was something else entirely. He was a person who seemed to be completely grounded, uninterested in fame or fortune, and yet somehow still revered by millions. That night, as the reporter sat in his hotel room typing up his article, he realized that he didn't know how to write the story. He had nothing to work with. There was no juicy headline, no scandalous revelation to share with his readers. He had gone into the interview hoping for a fight, but instead, he had gotten something far more complicated: a person who was impossible to provoke, someone who didn't care about the superficial aspects of fame. Frustrated, the reporter tried to refocus. He had to write something, even if it wasn't the story he had imagined. He decided to focus on Keanu's quiet resilience, his unwillingness to conform to the Hollywood mold. But even as he typed, something felt off. The words didn't capture the full depth of what he had witnessed. There was no drama, no fireworks, but there was something undeniably powerful in Keanu's presence. The more the reporter thought about it, the more he realized that Keanu's strength lay not in fighting back, but in choosing not to engage with the trivialities of the world around him. It wasn't the kind of story he usually wrote, but maybe that was exactly the point. The next morning, the reporter met up with some of his colleagues over breakfast. They were all discussing the red carpet event, sharing their stories of the celebrities they had interviewed, the questions they had asked. The reporter kept quiet for the most part, unsure of how to explain the conversation he had had with Keanu. It wasn't what he had expected, and in some strange way it left him feeling both empty and filled at the same time. One of his colleagues, noticing his lack of enthusiasm, leaned in. "So how was it with Keanu?" she asked, a smirk on her face. "I bet you got him to open up, right? Maybe some dirt on his personal life?" The reporter hesitated. "Not really," he said, trying to sound casual. He's pretty much exactly what you see. Calm, quiet, and totally uninterested in anything that doesn't align with his own values." His colleague raised an eyebrow. "So no drama? No juicy quotes?" she pressed. The reporter shook his head, feeling a strange sense of guilt wash over him. "No, nothing like that. He's not like the others. He's different." His colleague gave him a skeptical look. "Different? What does that even mean?" "It means he's not playing the Hollywood game," the reporter said slowly, still trying to process his own thoughts. "He doesn't care about being famous. He's not worried about staying relevant. He just does his thing no matter what people think." "Sounds boring," his colleague said, laughing. "Who cares about that? People want to read about the drama, the chaos." The reporter didn't respond. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Was that what the world really wanted? Drama, chaos, scandal? Was that the kind of story he was supposed to tell? And if that was the case, did he even want to be part of it anymore? As the day went on, the reporter tried to shake off the unsettling feelings that had begun to settle in his chest. He had a job to do after all. He was a journalist. He was supposed to dig, to uncover the truth, to give people what they wanted to hear. But something inside him had shifted. For the first time in a long time, he was questioning the very thing he had always taken for granted, the value of sensationalism. Later that afternoon, the reporter's editor called. She wanted an update on the Keanu story. The reporter hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's no big story," he said, feeling a strange mix of frustration and resignation. "I tried to get something out of him, but he's not like the others. He's just a decent guy." The editor was quiet for a moment, then replied, "Well, we need something, and we need it now. Our readers don't care about decent. They want the inside scoop, the truth behind the actor. You can spin it however you want, but we need a headline." The word stung, but the reporter didn't argue. He knew how this worked. In the world of entertainment journalism, there was no room for the truth if it didn't fit the narrative. The reporter had played along for years, giving the public the stories they wanted to hear, no matter how shallow or misleading they might be. But now, in this moment, he wasn't sure he could continue down that path. That evening, as he sat alone in his hotel room, staring at his blank screen, the reporter felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He could write the story his editor wanted. He could twist Keanu's words, make him sound defensive, make him seem bitter about his career. It would be easy, and it would get him the clicks, the attention, the headlines. But something told him that wasn't the right thing to do. Instead, the reporter decided to take a different approach. He wrote about Keanu's authenticity. He wrote about how the actor had remained true to himself despite the pressures of Hollywood. He wrote about how, in a world that often seemed obsessed with fame and fortune, Keanu had chosen a different path, one of humility, peace, and quiet strength. It wasn't the story his editor had asked for, and it wasn't the story his colleagues would want to read. But it felt like the right story to tell. The next morning, the reporter sent in his article. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was honest. He didn't know how it would be received, but he was okay with that. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something real, something that wasn't just about chasing the next big headline, but about capturing a moment of truth. As the days passed, the reporter's article slowly started to gain traction. It wasn't a viral sensation, but it was shared more than he had expected. People seemed to appreciate the sincerity of the piece, and some even reached out to thank him for writing about Keanu in such an honest way. It wasn't the kind of story that made him famous, but it was the kind of story that made him feel like he had done something that mattered. In the end, the reporter realized something important. The true power of a story didn't come from the drama or the scandal. It came from the people who lived it, who were brave enough to be themselves in a world that often tried to push them into a mold. Keanu had shown him that sometimes strength wasn't about fighting back. It was about standing firm in your own truth, no matter what anyone else thought. A week passed since the interview, and the reporter couldn't stop thinking about it. The article he had written about Keanu was out in the world now, and the reactions were rolling in. To his surprise, it wasn't the backlash he had expected. People seemed to appreciate the piece for its honesty and the way it captured something rare in the world of celebrity. Keanu was a man who, in a sea of flashy personalities, stood out for his calm and genuine nature. The reporter, however, still wrestled with his own thoughts. He had spent years in the industry, writing stories that were designed to get a reaction, to provoke or stir up some kind of excitement. He had never been interested in writing about authenticity or peace, especially not about someone like Keanu, whose every move seemed to challenge the very system the reporter had grown accustomed to. Yet something about the way Keanu had handled the situation stayed with him. There was a depth in the actor that was almost impossible to ignore. The way he answered questions, the way he carried himself, Keanu seemed to move through the world with a sense of purpose that the reporter couldn't quite comprehend. It wasn't just about being a famous actor. It wasn't about selling tickets or appearing in magazine spreads. It was about something deeper, something that the reporter couldn't quite put his finger on. But Keanu wasn't just another celebrity who had found fame and fortune. He had clearly done something different with his life, something the reporter couldn't help but admire. It wasn't just about his career, it was about his character. Keanu wasn't playing a role. He was living the role, staying true to himself no matter what the world expected of him. The reporter's thoughts were interrupted by a call from his editor. "I've got a follow-up piece lined up. It's a short piece, but I think you'd be perfect for it," she said. The reporter, still lost in thought, snapped out of his daze. "What's it about?" "It's about Keanu. His next film is coming out and we need to follow up on the piece you wrote. We're thinking of a short interview to go deeper into his philosophy. Explore what makes him tick." The reporter felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Another chance to speak with Keanu. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but at the same time, he couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward the actor. Something about him intrigued him, drew him in, even though the reporter had never been interested in someone like Keanu before. The very idea of digging deeper into his thoughts, his beliefs, almost felt like a test. A test of the reporter's own understanding of success, of life, and of what really mattered. "All right," the reporter said, finally giving in. "I'll do it." The day of the interview arrived, and the reporter once again found himself waiting in a small room, hoping that this time the conversation would be different. He was armed with a notebook full of questions, but he couldn't help but wonder if he would be able to provoke the kind of answers he was used to getting. He was no longer sure what he was expecting from Keanu. Was he still going to try to stir up something dramatic? Or had the actor somehow gotten under his skin in a way that made him question his whole approach to journalism? When Keanu entered the room, the reporter was once again struck by how unassuming he seemed. There was no entourage, no publicist hanging around to make sure everything went smoothly. Just Keanu, with his calm, steady presence, walking into the room like he belonged exactly where he was. The contrast between Keanu and the other celebrities the reporter had interviewed over the years was striking. Other stars had an aura about them, a kind of energy that demanded attention. But Keanu's energy was different. It wasn't about demanding attention, it was about making space for others. "Good to see you again," Keanu said, his voice warm but reserved, as he took a seat across from the reporter. There was no pretension, no hint of impatience. He simply seemed like someone who was comfortable in his own skin. The reporter nodded, a little unsure of where to begin. He had prepared questions about the new film, about his career, but those felt like they would only scratch the surface of who Keanu really was. After the first interview, he knew that there was more to the actor than just his work on screen. "So how have you been?" the reporter asked, trying to keep the tone casual. Keanu smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that tried to put on a show. It was a quiet smile, as if he was truly glad to be talking. "I'm good. Life is good. I stay busy, but I try to keep things balanced." The reporter paused, looking at the actor. The answer was simple, but it was also so telling. Keanu didn't talk about fame or success. He didn't talk about his latest project or how it was going to be the next big thing. He talked about balance. He talked about keeping life good, keeping it centered. The reporter suddenly felt like he was getting a glimpse of something real, something that most people would never see. "I've been thinking a lot about the last time we talked," the reporter said, before he could stop himself. "About what you said about not being in this for validation." Keanu's eyes didn't widen with surprise. He simply nodded, acknowledging the thought. "It's true," he said. "I don't think I need validation. I think everyone has to find their own way of doing things. We all have to figure out what matters to us, what makes us feel whole. I'm just fortunate that I get to do what I love." The reporter wrote down the words, his hand moving faster than usual. There it was again. Keanu's complete disregard for the typical celebrity mindset. He wasn't concerned with staying in the limelight. He wasn't chasing after fame or the praise of others. He was just doing the work that resonated with him. "I get the sense," the reporter continued, "that you figured out a lot of things that most people never even think about." Keanu looked at him with a steady gaze, but there was no arrogance in his eyes. "I don't know about that," he said. "I just try to be honest, with myself, with others, and I think when you do that, things start to fall into place." There was something about the simplicity of his words that felt almost profound. The reporter wasn't sure why it was affecting him so much. It wasn't as if Keanu had revealed some deep, hidden truth. It was more like he had just shown the reporter how much was right in front of him, in plain sight. "What does honesty mean to you?" the reporter asked, the question slipping out before he could really think about it. Keanu thought for a moment. "Honesty isn't just about being truthful with others. It's about being truthful with yourself. It's about not hiding parts of who you are even when it's hard to face. The words lingered in the air for a moment. The reporter knew that he was hearing something that went beyond just a nice soundbite. He was hearing a philosophy, a way of life that was completely different from anything he had encountered before. I think a lot of people, Keanu continued, are afraid of being themselves because they think they won't be accepted. But the truth is, when you embrace who you are, the people who really matter will find you. They'll see you for who you really are, and that's what really matters. The reporter sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had come into this interview expecting to dive deeper into Keanu's career, expecting to pry into the parts of his life that were hidden from the public. Instead, Keanu had turned the tables on him. The interview wasn't about the actor's films or his fame. It was about something much more important, about life, about being authentic, and about finding peace in a world that often valued everything except that. For the first time in a long time, the reporter felt something he hadn't expected to feel during an interview: respect. He respected Keanu, not for his career or his fame, but for his unwavering commitment to living authentically, for being someone who didn't need the approval of others to feel whole. As the interview came to an end, the reporter knew that this was going to be another article, a piece that would, once again, stand out from the usual celebrity fluff. But this time he wasn't trying to force a headline. This time he was simply telling the truth. Keanu stood up, his presence calm and assured. "Thanks for the time," he said, offering a smile. The reporter nodded, his mind still racing with everything they had talked about. "Thank you," he said quietly, realizing that this was one interview that would stay with him long after the story was written. A few weeks had passed since the interview, and the reporter found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The article about Keanu had been published, and the response had been overwhelming. It wasn't a story that caused a media frenzy or sparked major controversy, but it resonated with people in a way he hadn't anticipated. The piece about Keanu's genuine character, his refusal to play the Hollywood game, and his focus on inner peace had struck a chord. Readers from all over sent messages, some praising the piece for its refreshing take on a celebrity, others thanking him for highlighting what they felt was often missing in the chaotic world of entertainment: authenticity. The reporter had thought he was just doing his job, writing a follow-up article, but the experience had changed something in him. His usual cynicism, the edge that had once driven him to chase after scandals and sensational stories, was slowly starting to soften. Writing the piece about Keanu had felt different. It wasn't about creating drama or uncovering some shocking truth. It was simply about sharing the truth of who Keanu was without any embellishments. It was the kind of story he had never thought he would write. But now that he had, he couldn't help but wonder why he had spent so many years chasing after the opposite. The world of celebrity journalism was a strange one. It was a world where stories were twisted, where headlines were created to grab attention, and where people were constantly forced into molds they didn't fit. The reporter had always been a part of that world, but lately it didn't feel quite as comfortable. He had always justified it by telling himself that it was just a job, just a way to make a living. But now, after everything he had learned from Keanu, the whole system seemed hollow. His editor had called him a few days after the piece had been published, and at first he was worried she would be upset that the article hadn't stirred up more drama. But when he spoke with her, her tone was different. "You did good," she said simply. "I think people liked it. It wasn't the typical headline grabber we're used to, but there's something to it. It's honest and people appreciate that." The reporter had been surprised by the praise. It wasn't often that his editor acknowledged his work without pushing for more sensationalism. He had expected her to push him to go after something bigger, something more exciting, but instead, she had acknowledged the value of the story for what it was: something real. But the reporter couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads in his career. He had spent years writing the same type of stories, chasing after the next big scoop, feeding into the cycle of gossip and speculation. But now, after getting to know Keanu, he wondered if there was a different path for him. Maybe he didn't need to keep playing the game the same way. Maybe there was another way to tell stories. Stories that mattered. Stories that didn't need to rely on controversy to catch people's attention. He wasn't sure what that looked like yet. He still needed to make a living, and the media world wasn't exactly known for rewarding journalists who chose the path of quiet introspection. But Keanu's words had stuck with him. The actor had said it himself. When you embrace who you are, the people who really matter will find you. Those words had a weight to them, a kind of quiet truth that made the reporter question everything he thought he knew about success and fulfillment. One afternoon, as he sat in his office staring at his computer screen, the reporter received a message that surprised him. It was from Keanu. He had been hesitant to reach out again, not knowing if Keanu would even remember him. After all, he had been just another journalist, one of many who had crossed paths with the actor. But there it was, a short message. I read your article. Thank you for writing it the way you did. It's not often that someone sees beyond the surface. The message left the reporter both humbled and grateful. It was one of those rare moments in life where someone who had no reason to be kind, took the time to offer genuine appreciation. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an invitation for a follow-up interview or an offer of exclusive access. It was simply a thank you. And in that moment, the reporter realized just how much that simple act of kindness meant. He sat for a long time after reading the message, thinking about Keanu's words, about everything he had learned from the interview and the article. It wasn't just about writing the story. It was about how he had written it. He had gone into the interview with the intention of finding something, but in the end he had found something far more valuable than any scoop or exclusive. He had found a different way to look at the world, a way that didn't rely on sensationalism or drama to capture attention. The reporter knew that the next step in his career wouldn't be easy. He didn't know exactly what that step would look like, but he had an idea. He wanted to write stories that mattered, stories that were honest, that showed people for who they really were, not just for the persona they projected for the public. He wanted to move beyond the surface-level celebrity gossip and dive into the deeper truths of human nature. It wasn't a path that guaranteed fame or success, but it felt like the right one. It felt like a way of telling stories that wouldn't just entertain, but could make people think, make them reflect on their own lives and values. A few days after receiving Keanu's message, the reporter sat down to write a new article. This time, it wasn't about a celebrity interview or a follow-up piece for a film. It was about something more personal. It was about his own journey, his own realization that there was more to life than chasing the next big headline. It was about the lessons he had learned from Keanu, not just about celebrity or fame, but about the importance of living authentically. As he wrote, the reporter felt a sense of peace that had been missing from his work for a long time. He wasn't just writing to meet a deadline or satisfy an editor's demands. He was writing because he believed in the story. He was writing because for once he felt like he was telling the truth. The piece was published a few days later, and although it didn't cause a stir or attract the kind of attention that his previous articles had, the reporter felt something different. He felt proud. It wasn't about the likes or the clicks. It was about writing something that felt true to him, something that reflected the kind of person he wanted to be. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't filled with scandal, but it was real, and that, in the end, was what mattered the most. In the weeks that followed, the reporter continued to write, but with a new perspective. He didn't abandon his career or his role in the media world, but he began to make conscious choices to write with more intention. He started to turn down stories that felt shallow or exploitative, and instead, he sought out stories that highlighted the humanity behind the headlines. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't always get the kind of attention he had once craved, but it felt like the right path, and whenever he thought about his interview with Keanu, he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the kind of story that made headlines, but it had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. Keanu had taught him that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to simply be yourself, to be honest and authentic in a world that often values anything but. It wasn't the story the world thought it wanted to hear, but it was the story the reporter needed to tell, and for that he would always be grateful.